Last week, the new French Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, introduced a draft budget which was seen as hugely provocative. France has one of the worst deficits and debt burdens in Europe, and the government's proposing to tackle this problem head-on with a range of tax increases and, on the other hand, spending cuts. If passed, the budget would save 60 billion euros next year, which would be at least part of a journey towards finding 110 billion euros over the next several years. This would be achieved through 41 billion euros of spending cuts, including thousands of job cuts across government departments, and 19 billion euros in new taxes, focused on businesses for the main part, with some from higher taxes on wealthy individuals. France's recent deficit spending, which spends more every year than it brings in, came largely in the attempt to shield households and businesses from an energy cost crisis, as well as, of course, of COVID-19. It left a legacy of debt at more than 110% of the country's gross domestic product. Interest payments on that debt cost more than 50 billion euros this year and will hit 80 billion euros in 3 years if no change in direction is achieved. Now, just for context, today's interest payments cost more than France's total defence budget. What France is doing here is remarkable for two reasons. One, the fact that anyone is doing this is unusual. I mean, it ought to be the other way round. So many countries have been becoming more and more deeply indebted in recent years. Arguably, these sorts of budgets should be the norm rather than the exception. But it's not. And that's largely because populations tend not to be tremendously long-term focused or understanding when it comes to raising taxes at the same time as reducing public spending. And the second reason why this is remarkable, this is France. Not only does it have a reputation of a population that will take to the streets at the drop of a government hat, but also the current government is exceptionally weak, having no majority of its own in Parliament whatsoever, following Macron's recent relatively disastrous calling of elections. Europeans are used to the idea that southern European states such as Greece and Spain and Italy end up in bad financial straits, but right now France's fiscal position is worse than any of those. Antoine Armand, the French economy minister, said, "The economy is resilient, but our public debt is colossal. To not recognise this would be cynical and fatal." But not recognising such realities is the norm, and I'm rather expecting that over the next few weeks in France we'll get yet another demonstration as to why that is. France's warring political parties, none of which has a majority in Parliament, have precious little incentive to associate themselves with a budget that will provoke significant pushback. So all you can say about France's measures is it's a bold move. Watch this space. Elsewhere, you might think that such questions don't apply. I mean, take the current US presidential election, for instance. Neither Kamala Harris nor Donald Trump have even much mentioned the spiralling US debt burden, and both of them are running on programs that will continue year on year to spend more money than is currently being brought in through taxation. The US national debt now stands at around $33 trillion. $7 trillion of that is what's called intra-governmental debt holdings. Effectively, you could say money that the government owes itself, but that leaves approaching $26 trillion debt held by the public, effectively 100% of GDP. The principle for such debt is that, look, you should spend big, yes, when you're in a crisis, whether it be war, financial collapse, or, dare I say, pandemic. But then when the economy is recovered and going well, and the US economy has been the most dynamic in the world recently, then you gradually bring that debt down so that you have the capacity to meet the next crisis, which will be along in due course. To give some context, after World War II, the US national debt topped out at just over 100% of GDP. In other words, slightly more than the value of all the goods and services produced in America at that point in a calendar year. Over the following decades, it was brought down pretty sharply. It started to shoot up again during the Ronald Reagan presidency, thanks to a range of factors, including higher defence spending, which was the height of the Cold War, remember, and tax cuts. The deficit tripling in value terms from $738 billion to $2.1 trillion. This period alone saw the US move from being the world's largest international creditor to becoming the world's largest debtor, a fact that Reagan described as the biggest disappointment of his presidency. Indeed, in the 1992 election, the businessman Ross Perot stood as a third-party candidate specifically to highlight the issue of the growing national debt. At that point, it had climbed to 46.8%, seemed to be on an upward trend that he described as wholly unsustainable. Whether because of his pressure or not, the deficit was brought down through the Clinton years and stayed steady-ish through the George W. Bush years until the 2007-2009 financial crisis. At that point, and through the Obama years generally, the debt went up significantly. It continued to creep up during Trump's presidency, spiking up again when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, which brought the national debt nearly back to the level that it had been immediately after World War II. The only thing is that instead of now starting to bring it back down again, sharply as it was done then, projections are only for more and more deficit spending, pushing it further and further into new territory. And this is not a party political thing. Under the policies of either party standing in this election, debt will, over the next couple of decades, keep on going to reach 200% of GDP, not at exactly the same speed, but just as relentlessly. Bear in mind, things are relatively stable right now. The US economy is doing well on many measures, so you would think that now is the time when the sun is shining. It's when you're supposed to be fixing the roof before the next rains come. Instead, if the debt grows and grows, then the next time crisis hits, and there are so many potential crises that could be the next one in line, America will be greeting that from a more heavily indebted starting point than it has ever been. Where does all of this debt come from? It comes from the sale of US treasuries, which so far, because the US is the world's leading economy by far, and it's also the dollar is the world's reserve currency, always have found buyers. Find buyers because they're seen as safe and reliable. But you know what eventually makes them less safe and less reliable? That's right, chronic debt issuance, to the degree that America becomes less able to deal with a recession or with a crisis. A.J. Rajajaksha, Global Chair of Research at Barclays, told the Financial Times in June this year, "We are spending money as a country like a drunken sailor on shore for the weekend." Torsten Slock, the chief economist at Apollo Global Management, also told the FT that the US has always been special, but it is now testing the limits. The question is, what emergency now justifies what is historically wartime levels of borrowing? If there's no immediate crisis, then is it simply evidence, as some would say, of a decadent society that has lost all semblance of self-discipline? Decadent as in the stage that empires go through just before they fall. And it was exactly such decadence, accompanied by soaring debt funded basically by printing money, that Ray Dalio identified as being the key factor in the downfall of great empires in his book. He quoted economist Claudio Borio saying, "Markets could at some point question fiscal sustainability. We know from experience that things look sustainable until Suddenly, they no longer do. America still has the benefit of its strong position in the world, which is being eroded, but from a pretty high base. And without immediate alternatives to hand, US Treasuries are still the world's safe haven. This is being polluted by excess debt, but it's not yet critical. China has the ambition to start displacing the dollar as the global currency, but is a long way from being able to do that for all that the US is going out of its way to be helpful to them. So in the meantime, we sit and watch the world's financial system being tied to a nation behaving anything other than prudently. The US will have to pay higher borrowing penalties to attract buyers for its debt in due course if it keeps going. The cost of welfare spending continues to climb, given all those baby boomers with their pension funds and their post-65 Medicare. Add to that then the interest on the debt, which for the US, as I mentioned for now is for France, is now bigger than the US defence budget. The US has a much bigger defence budget than France, of course. Add to that Donald Trump's unfunded tax cuts, or alternatively Kamala Harris's unfunded spending, and you enter a period where you just have to hope that you don't hit a recession anytime soon, because all of this is difficult enough during boom times. Once recession comes along, the need for spending goes up, receipts for taxes come down, you are in a whole world of hurt. And of course, once the US dollar does lose its reserve currency status, this massive overhang that could be borne with a little discomfort will become a crippling burden. It has happened before in history to the previous empires of the world. The inevitability of it happening again isn't carved in stone. It flows from choices and behaviours. But right now, the US is showing that it has learned nothing from that history and instead is modelling exactly that drunken sailor, out for a good time so long as the money holds out. You might be left with the impression that having all those allegedly smart people in charge with all the algorithms and sophistication in the world at their fingertips doesn't seem to be playing out how you would expect. Because instead of being respectful of basic financial laws of gravity, instead they use their intellect and sophistication to come up with all sorts of complex reasons why it's just fine to behave like this, in spite of all appearances. No doubt, when the inevitable payback time comes due, there will be cries of, "How could we possibly have known?" along with, "It was someone else's fault." Luckily, that's not going to happen tomorrow, which is kind of the point. There is still time for everyone involved to sober up, reimpose some degree of discipline. It's just that here we are in a key defining election and nobody is even making that case. So whoever takes the fall for America's eventual decline, it will be described as their legacy, but it won't be. It will actually be the legacy of a whole string of people who could have acted and didn't. Some of those people were on the ballot back in 2008 and 2016 and 2020, and yes, in 2024 as well.